Good evening and welcome. Hello, my name is Lynn O'Hara and I'm the Director of Programs for National History Day. Welcome to our third in a series of 5 National History Day Ask the NEH Expert Hangouts. We're here tonight to talk about performances. We know that there are lots of students preparing for both individual and group performances for the upcoming regional and affiliate contests. And we are so grateful to have some fabulous experts here to help us tonight. Really quickly, I just want to introduce you. We've got 2 coordinators who are hanging with us tonight to help answer questions about NHD rules. So say hello to Wendy Rex Atzett, who's our NHD in Utah coordinator, and Laura McCarty, who's one of our NHD in Georgia coordinators. Tonight we're joined live by 2 schools who are going to be joining us. The first are our middle schoolers. We've got students from Kern Middle School in Council Bluffs, Iowa. We also have students from West Catholic High School in Philadelphia, but it seems that they just got bumped off. But that's okay. My guess is they'll be back before it's their turn. What I'd like to do now is turn things over to Julia Wynn. She's a Senior Program Officer in the Division of Education Programs at the National Endowment for the Humanities, and she's going to say hello and introduce our presenter today.
Thanks, Lynn, and thank you to all of our guests who have joined us this evening. I'm going to start by saying a few words about National History Day, and then I'll introduce a few words about the National Endowment for the Humanities, and then I'll introduce our speaker for this evening. NEH is a federal agency. We fund research, education, and preservation of the humanities. We support a wide range of activities that would include the creation of books, websites, museum exhibitions, programs for teachers, as well as interpretation of the humanities, which is what we'll be talking about this evening. NEH has supported National History Day since its founding, and we continue to be an active partner with National History Day. We fund the first prizes at the National History Day contest, as well as special prizes for use of Chronicling America in National History Day projects. Chronicling America is a partnership between the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Library of Congress that has digitized over 9 million pages of historic American newspapers ranging from the 1830s up to the 1920s. And so these pages can be a really great resource for you as you are preparing your National History Day project. And as I mentioned a moment ago, there is also a special prize for the best use of Chronicling America. We also fund EdCitement, which is an NEH-supported website that brings together the best of the humanities on the web. EdCitement includes vetted websites as well as lesson plans dealing with various topics in the humanities. The third thing that we can offer for teachers is the Summer Seminars and Institutes and Landmarks of American History and Culture programs. These are summer professional development programs ranging from 1 week to 5 weeks. They offer a really in-depth look at a historical or other humanities-related topic. They also include a stipend to help cover travel and living expenses. Our website, NEH.gov, is a great place to explore all of these resources that I just mentioned and a lot more. So we definitely encourage you to take a look at the website. And with that very brief overview of NEH, it is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Todd Norris. Todd is the Director of Interpretation at the Children's Museum of Indianapolis, and before that he worked at Colonial Williamsburg, where he performed, directed, managed, and trained over 400 interpreters. He has also directed, acted, and taught at a variety of educational and cultural institutions. Todd has a BA in theater performance from the University of Findlay and an MFA in acting from the University of Louisville. So Todd is going to talk to you all tonight about interpreting history through performance. So I'll turn it over to Todd.
Thank you. I feel very lucky to be in the field that I'm in because I'm one of those rare people that's actually went to school for theater and has managed to make a career out of it for most of my adult life, which is kind of rare, actually. So I'll tell you a little bit about my background and how I got into the field. As a lot of people in museums, I kind of fell into it by accident. When I went to work for the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, I answered an ad for a job that was a training specialist. And they were looking at the time for someone who had experience in teaching, in performing, and in computer application training, which oddly enough was exactly what my background and experience had been in. So I went to work for Colonial Williamsburg without having a specific history background, but I had their amazing resources to take advantage of, and so I did a lot of my learning as I went along. And then I had the opportunity to become the manager of their performing arts area, and that's exactly what it sounds like. It's the part of the foundation that interprets and demonstrates music, theater, and dance as it was enjoyed by the residents of Williamsburg in the 18th century, in the late 18th century. And then from there I added on their evening programs, which is a very vital program of about 35 different programs and shows and concerts that run through most of the year in the evenings. And then eventually I added on responsibility for their street theater program, which is called Revolutionary City, and which through the course of a day presents anywhere between 3 to 6 vignettes and scenes throughout the restored area of Colonial Williamsburg that gives people an opportunity to sort of become immersed into the topics that were important and floating around during the wartime years of Williamsburg in the last part of the 18th century. And then from there, about a year and a half ago, I decided to take an opportunity to join the Children's Museum of Indianapolis as their Director of Interpretation, where I now have the oversight for all of the facilitated programs on a wide range of subjects, including science and history and paleontology and archaeology and social issues and early childhood development, as well as their actor-interpreter programs and their children's theater programs that take place in our own 350-seat thrust theater stage here at the Children's Museum. So I've had a lot of opportunity to approach what we call museum theater from both sides, both as an observer and also as a performer and a director and a writer. And every subject has its particular fascination and challenges, but in any case, what I really try to do when I'm creating a new piece or when I'm directing a piece or performing a piece is I try to figure out what's going to be that personal connection, that emotional connection that helps my audience understand what the character I'm presenting or that I'm writing for or that I'm directing for, how the audience can really understand and connect with those issues that are most important to that character. So that's kind of how I approach things, no matter what my role in the creative process is. It's kind of the same.
Great. Todd, thank you so much for joining us. You know that History Day students have a particular challenge in that they have to create a performance that's no more than 10 minutes. That's the absolute limit. And that kind of creates its own set of challenges. Before I ask my first question, though, I just want to mention, for everybody who's watching live, you are welcome to live tweet your questions, and we will answer as many of them as we can. Go on Twitter, use the hashtag NHD Hangouts. Make sure to put the S on the end, and we'll get those. We're monitoring those live as we speak. First question I have to ask you, a lot of students have asked questions about characters. Can you talk a little bit about how you choose which character or characters to use, and how do you kind of create a voice or decide what perspective to take on a historical issue?
Sure. Well, I think obviously, first of all, it depends on what your subject matter is. And in some cases, you might have subject matter that is strongly associated with a particular character in history. And just for example, you might want to be talking about something that is strongly connected with Thomas Jefferson or George Washington or Florence Nightingale or any big name person. But you might also want to be talking about a topic where the subject matter itself is the marquee name, if you will, like slavery or the women's rights movement or any particular subject like that. But in either case, I think when I'm trying to figure out what character I want to use, unless there's a really specific reason to use one of those big names, I'm going to be more likely to want to choose a lower recognition name as the person I'm representing. And I'll tell you why. Let's say, for example, I'm talking about let's say the Declaration of Independence. And I want you to understand how difficult the process was of creating the Declaration of Independence and getting a bunch of people to agree on it. And let's say that I choose to be Thomas Jefferson telling you that. Well, if I'm going to do this correctly, I've really limited my point of view, because now you can only have access, if I'm Thomas Jefferson, you can only have access to his ideas, his thoughts, and his opinions on how the creation of the Declaration went. But if, for example, I decide to be Thomas Jefferson's servant or another delegate to one of the conventions, or if I want to be a newspaper reporter who was reporting on these negotiations. Now I have not limited myself to just Thomas Jefferson's point of view or opinions, but now I can report out on a wider range of opinions that Mr. Jefferson may either not be aware of or may not want you to be familiar with. So I've widened up my perspective that I can legitimately talk about. So I like to look at those people that were associated with the big names, but weren't necessarily the big names themselves. Because as soon as you identify yourself as one of the big names, if you're doing your job correctly, you've limited yourself to a much more narrow perspective. So I like to it's almost like finding that fly on the wall. Who was in the room but wasn't necessarily having a lot of attention paid to themselves, so that they have a better chance to report on the proceedings more objectively.
That's a good idea. A lot of times students will overlook because they think they have to play the role of Mahatma Gandhi or Queen
Right.
Elizabeth, but maybe that there's different ways to kind of look at that from a new perspective. I think that's a good tip for students to think about. A lot of times right now, at this point of the year, most of our students are starting to wrap up research and to actually start writing their presentations. And for a lot of students, this can be a really big hurdle to jump over. What are some tips you can give students who are just getting started in the writing process?
Well, I think first of all, you really need to decide, even if you have your subject matter identified, you probably want to narrow your discussion and try to figure out what's the most important idea you want to get across. And I would say make it a fairly specific one and really articulate that in some kind of, I believe you write a process paper, and within that process paper you can take one paragraph or even part of one paragraph and really articulate a really clear, specific idea of what you're trying to get across. So it might, a generic statement might be something like, freedom of the press is good. But how can you make that more specific and more immediate, and so that you're not biting off too big of a piece to try to get across, but you're also really giving yourself a really specific idea to work with, so you're not worried about getting too broad, and that you can really get nice and detailed with what you're trying to get across.
I think that's a good point. A lot of times our students leave that process paper till the very, very end. And that's a great tip, to try to kind of do that first. Think out about what you want to do, and maybe that'll help get that script going.
Absolutely.
one of the things that a lot of students ask questions about is primary source material. If they've done some research and they have quotes from their person or from an event, what are some ways you can bring in primary source material while still maintaining the character of a performance?
That's really a great question, and I think you have to be very aware of your primary sources for a couple reasons. Because if you actually have quotes from the person you're presenting or that you're talking about, that becomes a really great way to communicate their ideas accurately. But at the same time, you want to be a little bit careful, and this is very tricky and very subtle, but most of the time people speak one way but they write a different way. And usually, particularly in the past, writing is a more formal way of expression than speaking. We tend not always to give as much thought to our sentence structure and our grammar when we speak than when we write. So you want to be a little bit careful, because sometimes if you just start to speak someone's written words, it almost sounds like you become like a newspaper article or encyclopedia entry, and that's not really the way we speak. We speak very casually and conversationally, even if it's from a different time period. So you can do a paraphrase of that quotation, and so you're still using the same general idea and the same words, but you may not always use an exact verbatim quote that still gets those ideas across, but in a very conversational way that doesn't sound quite so stilted. So the dialogue sounds a little more natural and it flows a little bit better. But that's going to be a really effective way to get those ideas across. And it's always a good idea to, bounce those ideas off other people, particularly as you're in the process of developing that script. If you start to want to incorporate some of those primary sources directly into your script, bounce those ideas off of people, speak them out loud, and see how they sound to you. See how they sound to other people. Does that sound like real conversation, or does it sound like it needs a little more polish? And work it in small little chunks, and that'll help you kind of get a flow and a rhythm together.
That's a good tip in terms of that practice. And also, I said, even if you can't get an audience, I always encourage students to videotape themselves.
Absolutely.
Set out your phone, turn the video on, and then watch it. It's hard to watch yourself sometimes, but I think that's how we learn and how we get better. One of the challenges that NHD students have is they have to connect to a theme, and they have to put their thesis statement out. So this year our theme is leadership and legacy in history. So they have to make an argument about a leader, or either an individual or group who was a leader, and then why they matter in history, not just what they did in history. What are some ways that you can suggest for students to help carry an argument throughout their 10-minute presentation?
Let's see. Well, I think a couple of things you can do, and this is a great topic because a lot of leaders didn't necessarily think of themselves as leaders at the time, but it was only after the events that they were involved in that society viewed them as a leader. Now, that's not always true. Sometimes you have somebody like Martin Luther King, who was very well aware that he was leading a cause, or someone else who might be the recognized leader of a group of people. But in many cases, leaders don't always think of themselves as leaders. So I think one thing that you can do is you can constantly ask yourself, how was this person's leadership? What were examples of their leadership throughout their lives, and how did their leadership manifest itself going forward after the events that you're talking about, that you're discussing? And keep even if you just do this while you're developing your piece, keep referring back to those key questions, because if you really kind of keep your eye on how did that leadership, what were concrete examples of that leadership through the person's life, and how has that leadership, how have examples of that leadership survived to today, that may help you keep your script on point and prevent you from going off into sidebars or tangents that may not be quite as necessary.
That's a good point. With 10 minutes, there's not a whole lot of wiggle room. And I
Right,
like your idea of keep coming back to, the concrete examples of leadership as opposed to writing a book report or
right.
writing a biography telling everything that someone did. Okay, I have one more question, then we're going to go to our students out in Iowa. But the one question that we get all the time is how do you and the people you work with handle stage fright?
I'll tell you, the best way to handle stage fright is a two-pronged attack. And this is my opinion, but I believe it and I've used it a lot. I've been performing all my life. The only time I get scared before I do a program or a performance is when I'm not confident of what I'm going to say. So that means that I rehearse and rehearse and rehearse and practice and practice and practice so that I'm 100% sure of my lines. If I'm not completely memorized, that's the only time I get nervous. So make sure that you're completely memorized of your lines and that you can do them backwards and forwards and in your sleep and upside down, and you can do it while there's other distractions going on around you so that you just know your lines so well nothing's going to shake you. The other thing is, don't think of it as going on stage and presenting a chunk of information to people that you don't know. If you think of it, though, if you've chosen the right topic, it's going to be something you connect with personally. And you're going to be personally involved in wanting to share this amazing information with all of your friends because it's that important. And everybody in your audience are your friends because they want you to succeed. They want to benefit from your experience, and they want to take this ride with you. So they're all on your side. And if you have got this amazing information that you just can't wait to share with these friends of yours, you're not going to think of it like a performance. You're going to think of it as a sharing opportunity with great friends, and you're going to have a lot of fun. And you won't even think about being nervous because you'll be having too good of a time as you do it.
Good idea. Okay, we're going to go to Kern Middle School, but for those of you who are tweeting your questions, I do see them and we're going to get to them, so keep them coming. Use the hashtag NHD Hangouts. So my students at Kern, what questions do you have for Todd Norris? Why don't we start with one?
Okay, Zach's going to go first.
How much of your state leadership and legacy throughout your script?
That's a good question. When should you use those keywords, and how much is too much?
Well, my first reaction would be let the material speak for itself. If you have the concepts in your process paper, I don't know that it's that important that those actual words are used very much in your dialogue or in your script. I tend to think that the material should speak for itself. The ideas you're trying to get across in your script and your dialogue, to my way of thinking, should carry that all across, because everybody in that audience knows what the theme is, because they're all on the same side there. So I would tend to say let the story be what's most important. You can use those key words in your process paper and maybe in your title of your piece, but I think really the subject should speak for itself more than having to be annotated like that.
Okay. Other questions from Kern?
What suggestions do you have to keep props and staging to a minimum?
I think the question is what ways can we keep props and staging? Because we've all seen those performances where a student's trying to juggle 25 different props and multiple backdrops, and honestly, you spend the time wondering if the tea kettle's going to fall off the table as opposed to listening to the performers. What tips can you give in that area?
Well, when it comes to props, I would say focus in on what's really crucial to help move the story forward. If the prop is something you're going to touch or handle, which I think is a wonderful idea because it gives your hands something to do and it makes your body look much more natural, then try to identify that minimum number of props that will help you do that. What would your character naturally hold? Or what in the course of your story, what are those key props that are really important for your character to move their story forward. And that way you can narrow it down to just those essentials. As far as the set, and I'm going to use the word set versus staging because to me, staging refers to how the actors move around on the set. And the set itself is the backdrop, the set pieces. So I'm going to use the word set. Again, what are those very key elements that are important, that are crucial to helping you get your point across? And I think it's much more important that you have, I'd rather you do something simple well than do something complicated that cannot be done quite as well. Because as Lynn said, you're not going to be worried about things falling off or getting knocked over because it's just so simple and so suggestive of what you're trying to get across that lets everybody focus on your work and they're not distracted by watching, you know, something else behind you that may not be as important. A lot of times when I used to judge the performances, sometimes the set pieces could even become more distracting because either they weren't well constructed and we were sitting there afraid they were going to fall over, or they might be almost overwhelming, where they were too big and too over the top and too, they just stole focus a little bit away from the actors. Because really, everyone wants to be focusing on you, and anything that you have in the way of a set, you really just want to help support you, but not take away or overwhelm from you. So I would say do something simple well, and just keep the props to the bare minimum that your character needs to get their points across.
Great. Ty, can you show really quickly, before we go to the next question from Kern, we have the backdrop image that you shared with us. Can you explain the way that this student used an effective backdrop?
Yes. In this particular situation, we had a situation. Is this the cliff backdrop?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Here at the Children's Museum, we have a gallery called Dinosphere. It's an incredibly beautiful gallery, but it's also a very modern interpretation of being back in the Cretaceous period. And we have a lot of very colorful and rich theatrical lighting in this gallery. But for this museum theater piece, we don't want that piece to take place there. We want the audience to be able to see this particular individual working on the British seashore, collecting seashells. And so we use a very basic hanging backdrop on a very basic PVC pipe frame, and that actor stands in front of that backdrop and does the majority of her piece standing there, so she's never having to interact with it. It's just something that helps pull the audience's eye away from all the distracting color and lights of the Dinosphere Gallery, and for about 8 to 10 minutes focuses their view right on the action that takes place in front of that backdrop. So it works very, very well for that, but it doesn't create a distraction.
Those are really good ideas, and I think you make a good point about using your backdrop to frame the action or to draw your eye to the presenter without distracting from that presenter. Let's go ahead. Let's get 1 or 2 more questions in from Kern.
Do you have any tricks for memorization, especially if you're doing an individual performance?
I do. One of the challenges is trying to think, oh my gosh, how am I ever going to learn 10 minutes worth of lines? And this is connected to what I said about stage fright. If you can really focus on why is your message so important, and how important is it that you get your message across, you're focusing on the importance of the message and why it's important. And you're not focusing on, okay, I've got to learn 10,000 words. So you're focusing on content and communication rather than rote memorization. A lot of us have seen amateur performers perform and it sounds like they're reading a report as opposed to actually communicating from the heart and the gut. And if you really focus on the emotional impact you want to make on your audience, if you're doing a solo performance, or the emotional impact your character wants to make on the other character if you're doing a group performance, that will help you memorize those words, because you're not just memorizing random words on a page, you're memorizing techniques and strategies to make an emotional impact on those others.
Great. Let's do one last question from Kern, and then we're going to pop over to West Catholic. Go ahead, Kern students. One more question that you really want to get in.
When you are working on a script, whether it's a play or a documentary, is it more important to use the actual words of the individual or group, or to paraphrase them and make them more natural to your speaking?
I think it depends a little bit on the specific situation. If you are going so far back in time, or if you're going to a culture that is different enough from ours that using their actual words becomes a distraction, then I would say a paraphrase might be more effective. But if you think that you can use their actual words and, again, connect it to an emotional impact, then I think you can do that. But also, I would say if those original words were designed to be spoken, then that may then those using those actual words may be more dynamic. But if those words were designed to be written, then, as I said earlier, sometimes they sound a little artificial when they're said out loud. So you can always try it both ways when you're in the script development process, and just find out which one has more impact, which version, either the actual verbatim quote or the paraphrase, which one gets your point across more strongly.
Great. Let's go ahead and jump over to West Catholic High School in Philadelphia. So we've got a couple questions from the students there.
Okay, Lynn, we're going to have one of our juniors actually ask a question first. So, Selena, it's your turn. Come on.
If I have a hard time remembering my line when it's practice time, do you have any tips on give my speed?
That's a great question. A lot of students struggle with losing a line, forgetting a line, or whether they're working as an individual or in a group. What tips do you give when that happens? Because it always does.
Right. And, you know, I'm going to continue on the same theme that I've been talking about. It's about trying to make a point more than it is trying to remember every single word that was on that page. The audience doesn't have your script, so we don't miss what we haven't heard. So if you are on a roll and you're really invested in that, if you're really invested in that moment, and all of a sudden you forget that line, but you remember the line after it, just skip ahead to that next line. Chances are the judges won't notice and the audience won't notice. And this is true in any kind of live performance. Most of the time, we only realize an actor screws up when they communicate to us that they screwed up. So just keep it your own little secret. Nobody will know, chances are. And if you forget a line that's really, really crucial because it's conveying important information, if you remember what the line's talking about, then just say something that gets that information across, even if it's not that exact line, and then go on back with your regular script. Because again, most of the time, we only know that an actor screwed up their lines because they tell us they screwed up their lines. We won't know if you don't tell us 9 times out of 10.
Great. Other questions from West Catholic?
Well,
Go ahead. If I'm working in a group, what is the best way to make sure everyone gets a chance to speak at least once?
if they're working in groups, how do you divvy up so that everybody's got a chance to talk, but they still feel comfortable doing it?
That's a key question, because often when you have presenters in a group, they have to figure out how to give weight to different voices. What are some tips and strategies you can pass their way?
Well, I think depending on the size of the group, this may work better in some situations than others. But I think, just do an internal check with the group. Does everybody want the same amount of responsibility as far as lines? Because you might find some people just want to say a little bit and other people may want to say more. That might help you determine, how you're casting your piece. But if everyone wants to have an equal contribution, then I would say figure out what story you want to tell, and then figure out how can you have the same number of characters as you have in your group, and they're all contributing to that same telling of the story. So someone might be, you might have some people that are, like I said earlier, connected to the main subject in a direct way or an indirect way. You might also represent people that are on the receiving end of an idea or a person. So you might also have an objective observer, somebody who maybe wasn't directly connected, but kind of watches the experience, almost like a narrator type. So I think that if you kind of just think about how many people you've got in your group, who wants to talk a little more and who might be happy talking a little less, and how you can best communicate that story, I think that's going to probably go a long way, because you always want the story to be the primary, the story is the most important. Figure out the story first, and then everything else kind of falls into place.
Excellent. Let's go. One more question from West Catholic, then we've got a lot of Twitter questions stacking up for us.
We're actually good, Lynn, so you can go to the Twitter.
Okay. Well, we've got a whole bunch of questions in here, and actually I'm going to bring our coordinators into this one. Here's a question that just came off of Twitter. Script prompts. When students go ahead and put either notes to themselves or sometimes script in a prop, something like a diary or a book. Wendy, can you talk about that? Is that a rules violation? And then Todd, I'm going to ask you if you think that's a good idea or not.
Well, it's not a rule violation, but I don't think it's a very smart thing to plan to be reading for very much of your performance. So I think it might be very natural in a performance to pick up a sample diary and read a small part from it, but that should not take the place of you having memorized your script.
Todd, what are your thoughts on that question?
Well, I think that it's a challenge because some people are very, very comfortable reading aloud and some people are not. And the one thing you don't want to have happen is you don't want to be talking along, I've got my lines memorized and here I am reading, and then all of a sudden I'm performing my memorized lines, and then all of a sudden I'm going to open a book and all of the sudden it sounds like I am reading aloud. Now I'm exaggerating that for effect, but sometimes that's what you get. So I think it can be challenging if you have a very short passage and it helps you to read it. I think as long as you are 100% confident that it sounds every bit as natural as your memorized parts, you might be able to get away with it. But I really think in the end, having the entire thing memorized is going to be safer, because you never know. You might drop the book, or the lighting in the space might be kind of funky and it's hard to read, or maybe your contacts, get messed up and you can't read it. I mean, there's just all kinds of things that can go wrong, but if you got it solidly memorized, you don't have to worry about anything else going wrong.
Great. Question for Laura here. Several students asked questions about, can you use projectors, CD players, music, other electronics as part of your performance? What are the rules about that?
Well, the rules are that you can, but you are responsible for providing the equipment, and you also may be presenting in a variety of shaped rooms, and so you want to make sure that your equipment is simple enough to be able to be managed in the time frame. It is important to also remember that the student is responsible for setting up all the equipment and for running the equipment. So Like I said, it is theoretically possible to use projectors and sound within the performance, but it has to be run by the students, and it has to be able to be taken to wherever the contest is and managed within the setting of the performance space.
Excellent. Todd, here's a question. Some of the students are asking about changing characters, especially a lot of our individual performers tend to do this. Can you give some tips on some effective ways to change characters? And what would be some ways to introduce a new character without saying, "Hi, my name is blank"?
Yeah, I think that it's a very, very challenging proposition to do successfully. Having said that, it can be done, but it takes a pretty skilled actor to be able to do it in a way that doesn't draw a lot of attention to the mechanics of it and still keeps, you've heard me talking about story and emotional content. If you're going to do it, I think some key ideas to keep in mind are making sure that any costume choice you make is simple enough that the audience is not distracted by you trying to change costumes in the middle of your piece to become another person. Unless you have just gotten the absolute highest level of confidence in your ability to do it, probably better to keep the costume more conceptual rather than literal, so you're not worried about taking off a bunch of pieces and trying to put other stuff on. That can just get really distracting. I think you want to try to find characters that are similar enough in who they are that you're not going from portraying a teenage girl to a middle-aged man. That's going to be a really tough shift to pull off that doesn't come across funny or comic. I think that you can do some very simple staging things. So for example, if I deliver one of my characters like this, even though my audience is out here, I'm focused over here, so I'm talking to someone who's over here. And then I make a very clear switch. And now I'm talking over here. So I've made two choices. My first focus is over here, and so that can be one character. And then I make a very clear change of focus to over here, and that may help just explain without explaining that I'm now someone else doing something else. I would say be careful about things like changing voices a lot, because again, it's going to be tough to do without sounding really artificial. Again, kind of my same themes over and over. Make a simple shift and make it clearly and done well, as opposed to trying to do something really elaborate. But I would also ask, how important is it really to change characters? Is it really that important, or can you find a way to communicate your idea through one character for the entire piece?
Great question. Wendy, I have a question for you. Are you allowed to edit or make changes to your performance from regional to an affiliate or state contest and to the national contest?
You are. In fact, that's one of the best things about National History Day, is that we encourage all the students to look at the judges' comments from the contest that they just completed and even go back and do more research and modify their script to make their project better, and to continue doing that as they move up through the series of contest levels.
Absolutely. Revision is probably the most important part of the process. Kind of on a similar vein, I'm going to actually ask this question to Todd and also to Laura. What is your suggestion? Should you have a 10-minute script, or should you write about 7 or 8 minutes and ad-lib part of it? That's one of our Twitter questions tonight. So Todd, why don't you take this, and then Laura, I'm going to toss this to you because I'm guessing you've seen this before. So Todd, go ahead.
I'm going to encourage you not to ad-lib any of it. I think that, part of having a script, in a way, it becomes a freeing technique, because you know what you have to get across, and you know the words you already have to. You've already chosen the words to make your point. The moment you ad-lib, then your mind is flooded with all these ideas and all of these choices to make, and that takes up time. Plus, it's really tough, even for professional actors, to go in and out of script while staying in character. That's really tough. And why give yourself that unnecessary burden? I'm also going to encourage you, I have seen, occasionally I have seen performances that I thought were too short, once in a while, but it's much more common that performances tend to run long. My personal preference would be to take, if you've got a 10-minute time limit, try to write about a 7 to 8 minute script and just rehearse it and rehearse it and rehearse it and time it constantly. Every time you do a full run through, time it and see where it's clocking. Sometimes you'll find that what you thought was one length in rehearsals actually becomes another length. And if you give yourself a minute or two's wiggle room, then you can figure out, do I need to slow down? Do I need to maybe edit some of it so that I don't rush too much while I'm speaking? And that way you're not playing beat the clock, because the last thing you want to do is put a lot of time and effort into a really great production to only have it run over time. Because then, again, the audience gets distracted by the mechanics of being cut off, as opposed to focusing on the quality of your communication with them.
Laura, what's your thought on ad-libbing from the performances you've seen?
Well, I agree with Todd. I think you should plan what you're going to say in the performance. When you go into the interview phase, you'll have an opportunity, in a way, to ad-lib, because you'll be responding to the judge's questions at that point. But you need to know what your argument is, and you need to develop a theatrical way to get that argument across within the 10-minute time limit.
Great. Wendy, question actually for Wendy and for Todd. Question about costumes. What are some tips for finding a good costume that's not too expensive? What are some strategies that you've seen students use effectively? Wendy, go ahead.
I have seen students use very, very simple costumes where they might just have a period hat or rather than an entire outfit, and that can work really very well. The rules say that you can make a costume, but the students need to be the ones who are designing and creating that costume, even if they have help sewing. You can also rent a costume, but that can get very expensive, and honestly, it's not always necessary to have a full costume, because what you're trying to do is suggest your character and keep it simple, as Todd has been saying.
Todd, what are some suggestions for costume pieces?
Well, I think you can try a couple different approaches. And again, part of it depends on what time period you're trying to, or what culture you're trying to represent. But if it's anything from the 20th century, you can choose a very neutral, basic costume. It could be something as simple as a very neutral suit for a male, like a dark gray or a black or a navy blue, or a solid colored blouse and skirt or dress, maybe black or, again, a dark gray or something like that, that doesn't draw attention to itself, so that we can focus on your performance. If you can identify some fairly simple costume pieces that are easy to get a hold of, maybe a jacket or a hat or a very simple apron or something like that. A good accessory piece on top of a neutral costume goes a long way, I think, as opposed to trying to create this really elaborate costume. Again, because that sometimes takes the focus off of the performance and onto those accessories, and you don't want to do that. It's, again, it's that same drum I've been beating, something simple well rather than something complicated that doesn't really work as well as you might have hoped. You don't need to spend a lot of money, and you don't need to bring in a whole wardrobe full of things. Just something that suggests it. And while we're talking about it, a lot of times makeup goes hand in hand with costume. And if you're a middle schooler or a high schooler, you're not going to look like an old person, no matter how hard you try. You just don't. You've got the benefit of youth, and you want to be careful about trying to play these old characters, because it's hard to do convincingly. And so you might want to give a lot of thought to making the choice in who's the best character to tell that story. Is it an old character, or is it maybe somebody who was with that older character or who observed that older character who can communicate that story in a way that's going to be a little less artificial? Because, actors of all ages have trouble playing old age until they get there, because they just don't have the benefit of that life experience.
Todd, here's another question. Accents, whether it be a British accent, a Southern accent, fill in the blank. What do you suggest with students? Should they use them? Should they not?
I think this is where you need the benefit of outside opinions that you trust. And this can be a teacher or an advisor. Be careful of asking your friends and your family, because they tend not to want to hurt your feelings, and they may want to tell you what they think, what you want to hear. But unless you can do those accents flawlessly, be very, very careful, because there's all kinds of British accents. And if you're trying to do a standard British accent or a royal British accent, and it winds up coming across like you're trying to do a Cockney or a Liverpool, it's going to sound not very effective. And if you're trying to do a Southern dialect, well, there's all kinds of Southern dialects, because Texas and Alabama and North Carolina and Georgia and Tennessee all sound a little bit different, and you have to be really, really careful. So, unless you can just get some objective opinions that tell you, yeah, you sound like you were born there, be really, really careful. One thing I can tell you is there's a generalization that I can make, and people from the South may disagree with me, and they're entitled to, but part of it is pace. What a lot of people think of as a Southern dialect is about the pace of the speech more than the actual Southern drawl. Because I know when you get in front of an audience, a lot of times you've got the adrenaline pumping and you start to speak really, really quickly. But if you remind yourself that what a lot of people think of as a Southern dialect is partially just speaking a little bit slower, that may give you the rhythm of a Southern dialect, but without the focus on the actual drawl and the vowel substitutions and the technical part of it. So just slowing that speech down may help you with a Southern dialect. Whereas, for example, a New York dialect or a New England dialect might be a little bit faster. But you have to be careful that you don't go so fast that people have a hard time understanding you. When in doubt, just use your own standard American dialect and don't speak too quickly, and that'll go a long way toward getting your point across.
Okay, I have time for one more question here. So I'm going to ask the question, Todd. What happens when something goes wrong? And I'm sure maybe you can tell us a story where you've been in a performance and things have just really collapsed around you. What do you do if that happens to you while you're presenting your NHD performance?
You know what? If it's something minor, remember what I said at the beginning. Everybody in that audience is on your side. They want you to succeed. They want to hear what you've got to communicate with them, and they want you to be successful. So if it's something small, if it's a little thing, just ignore it and go on. The audience half the time won't even notice it, and if they do notice it, they understand. That's part of the excitement of live theater. That's why we see live performance. It's for the excitement of never being 100% sure about what's going to happen. So if it's something small, just ignore it and go on. If it's something major, like a big piece of scenery falls over, or you drop a prop, or a costume falls off in the middle of your performance, you know what? Just think of yourself in that moment. If you have to pick that piece of scenery up, or if you have to pick that prop up, just do it while you're performing. Try to do it without drawing a lot of attention to it, and just keep going on. If it's something that is so major that you cannot continue, then as best you can, just take a moment, fix the situation, and by fix I don't mean necessarily repair it back to the way it was before the accident happened, but fix it in a way that you can then continue your piece. Don't get flustered. Try not to get too nervous. Stuff happens all the time, you know. Just push it out of your way, or step over it, or brush the broken pieces off to the side and keep going with your piece as best you can. The people there, including the judges, want to see you succeed, and so they're not going to hold those kind of things against you.
Great. Those are all really great suggestions moving our students forward into developing their performances. So I'm going to turn things over to Julia Wynn in just a second, but I need to say thank you to our coordinators, Wendy and Laura, for joining us tonight. Thank you to our teachers and students in Iowa and Pennsylvania. And Julia's going to wrap us up and remind us all about the survey that helps give us feedback on these Hangouts.
Thanks, Lynn. I also want to thank all of you all for taking part in the Hangout this evening. I especially want to thank Todd for all of the really great help that he provided this evening. A couple of reminders. One is remember that NEH offers a lot of resources that can be helpful to you as you are working on your National History Day projects. So remember to check out Chronicling America, check out Incitement, and some of the other resources that we have on our NEH website. Also remember the work of the state humanities councils. A lot of them are really very heavily involved in National History Day. They can be a great resource as well. And then finally, as Lynn mentioned, please make sure to click the link right under the Hangout and fill out the survey. That really helps us improve future Hangouts so that we can help you better. So thanks to all of you.
Well, thanks so much, everyone. Best of luck with your performances. We'll see you for Leadership and Legacy in History. Our regional coordinators are just getting started. We're looking at most of our regional contests will be in February and March. Moving on to our affiliate contests at the end of March, April, and May. And we will see you, hopefully, at the national contest at the University of Maryland at College Park in June. Thanks so much. Have a great night.